You're listening to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life. I'm your host, Gregory Heller, from the MBA Career Management Office at the Foster School of Business at the University of Washington. This season, I'll be joined by co-host Jonathan Azoff, the co-founder and general partner of Snowcap, a venture capital firm investing in deep tech climate solutions in our global supply chains, for a series we're calling Conversations on Careers in Climate Tech. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks, Gregory. Over the course of this season, we'll talk to entrepreneurs across climate tech and sustainability about their careers and the career opportunities for job seekers looking to impact one of the greatest challenges facing humanity. We'll break each conversation into 2 episodes, the first focusing on our guest's business, how it came to be, who their customers are, and what kind of impact they hope to have.
And the second will focus on the advice our guest has for job seekers looking to make a pivot into this space. This season is made possible with funding from Snowcap. You can learn more about their fund and portfolio of investments at snocap.vc. Our guest today is Stephen Zhang. Stephen is the founder of Climate Tech List, the web's most comprehensive climate tech job site for tech and non-tech professionals looking to work on climate change. Stephen, welcome to Conversations on Careers in Climate Tech.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So we wanted to have you on as one of the first guests for this season because we feel that most people, when they think about jobs in climate tech, think about, well, how do I find them? Where's the place? And the Climate Tech List, I'm constantly referring people to it. And just yesterday shared an internship, an MBA level internship that I found on Climate Tech List with some of my students. So welcome to the show. Why don't you start by telling us a bit about how the Climate Tech List came to be?
Yeah, great. So a little bit quickly, my background, I started working in 2014 as a software engineer actually in Seattle. I worked at Tableau and then Airtable. So I have a joke that every company that I work at or start has to have the word table and now list in it, right? The data is just like a thing that I've always used a lot of in my job as a software engineer. And when this current kind of boom in clean tech, or now it's rebranded as climate tech, started in 2019, 2020, I started following it pretty intently. By that time, I had moved to San Francisco. And one thing that I really saw was, basically it's like, what do people think of when they think about working on climate tech? It's like, how do I get a job in it? So around end of 2019, I figured, okay, I'm going to pick a niche and I'm just going to try to build a useful tool for these people in these niches. And I was still working at Airtable during this time, all the way up until earlier this year. So this is 2020, 2021, I realized that the problem that I saw with my friends who were curious about climate tech, but weren't as intently in the space, is they got overwhelmed by the amount of information and the space, just kind of the amount of choice out there, right? You got to remember at this point, the tech market for jobs was very different. There were way more software jobs than software engineers, or at least, that was kind of the software engineers, the candidates had the power. And so what I originally started it as was inspired by a few of these lists out there. There's Wealthfront list and Breakout list. They're targeted towards tech professionals that are, the basic premise is let's curate everything and present a small list so that people looking for a job don't get overwhelmed. And this is kind of here are our top picks. And I've just continued that project until today. And one thing that changed was earlier this year with all these tech layoffs, a lot of the users of the website started telling me, hey, you know what? We actually want more than just I think I had 20 companies to start. Just give me all the jobs. So then I was like, okay, well, if I were to think about what that kind of product would look like, I should probably just figure out a way to get as many jobs updated as possible from as many of these companies as possible. So just to give you a sense of how it's changed is it's gone from 30 companies, and I didn't even list the jobs when I first started it, to over 1,000 with like 30,000 jobs. And I think that's what kind of the current macro labor market demands, right? Like it's actually a little bit challenging depending on your role to find a job. So the tool that people need is like a comprehensive list, or as comprehensive as possible. No tool is ever fully comprehensive.
And searchable.
So it was a bit long.
And searchable, because there are other job lists and newsletters that come out. I won't name them, but you have to sort of read through every one and see like, oh, is this right for me? Is this right for me? Is this in the right spot? But on the Climate Tech list, because it's built with Airtable, there's a bunch of exposed filters, and you can really dial in exactly what you're looking for, your criteria, to find the kind of thing that is most likely to be a good fit for you.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is one like kind of weird takeaway I had from working at Airtable is it like the Airtable shared table, we call it shared view, is one of the like best, like if you have an item, like thousands of items, you just want to display it well, like that's the best thing. We could talk about this later, but I have a couple other websites. They're all centered around like an Airtable shared view for this reason.
So you started this off, you said you were working at Airtable. This is sort of like a side hustle, little passion project.
Yeah.
How has it grown and shifted for you since its inception?
I would say, honestly, when I was at Airtable, it was just, it started as a Google Doc that I just shared with friends. I have a lot of Google Docs, and I think the kind of the level of polish from Google Doc to like publishing it online for everyone to see is a pretty high gap, just because I'm very careful. Like I don't want anything I write to be like forever on the internet. So I had a lot of Google Docs at that time, and a friend encouraged me while I was there at Airtable to just like launch a low code website. So I didn't write any code for it. And then when I left Airtable around beginning of this year, end of 2022, I was like, oh, okay, well, I want to do a bunch of projects, and some of them will turn into bootstrap businesses and some of them won't. Let me see, the Climate Tech list is something I already have. So let me double down on it and like spend some time to grow it. So I think the first half of this year is where I spent the most time on it. Like really, well, I had to like spend a lot of time rebuilding the website, building the backend to get the jobs, and doing a bunch of marketing to like get it out there, which was mostly on LinkedIn. I think now it's kind of at a steady state, so I don't spend as much. I was probably spending like 50 to 100% of my time for a couple months in the first half of this year. It's mainly in like maintenance mode / when people ask for features, I'll grow it. So that's kind of how it's grown for me, my involvement. And it's just me. It's always just been me.
So how is it a business? I think I know the answer to this question, but why don't you tell us like how it went from being this thing that started off as a Google Doc and then became an Airtable shared table, and now
I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking the same thing, because like you're not at Airtable, right? And you're making an income ostensibly, I imagine. So yeah, when did that transition become possible?
Yeah, no, I actually so I don't mind being pretty transparent here. So I was at Airtable for like almost 4 years, and there was a big layoff in December, so I was affected. And there's all these tech layoffs at the time, which were just beginning. I think Airtable has actually done like 2 layoffs in the last 9 months, and it's like 50% of everyone who's worked there has been like laid off ish, something like that. And so I didn't really like. I had been planning to like do my 4 years at Airtable and kind of like leave and do a bunch of these bootstrapped software businesses, focused as much as possible on climate, because that was the area I was like really interested in. But I due to layoff, I think the hand was kind of forced.
You got kicked out.
But I spent the first something like that. And honestly, I think when I was working at Airtable, I didn't really think about monetizing. So you can talk to a lot of people in the climate community at that time, especially through MCJ. I just gave people like free consulting, which now I'd probably charge for if I was doing more of that. But I think I logged over like 100 half an hour calls just during that period, just to learn about the space. And a lot of that was some venture capitalist was like, hey, can you help me with the Airtable? Or like some company was like, we're thinking about doing data viz. What should we do? And I never charged for that because I think that's one of the nice things about working in climate too, is I'm like, okay, I can either make money from this or I cannot make money, but that's still a value add thing. That's like positive for society. That's a good volunteer opportunity, right? So it's kind of this weird mix. So I didn't really focus too much on monetization during the first couple months. I was just like, let me just build stuff and kind of see. I would say that monetizing job board in this environment is pretty difficult. Like my revenue, like overall, is mostly not from Climate Tech List. We can talk about the other things I'm working on later if you'd like. But I would say that what's changed in the labor market for white collar workers, for the most part, especially that come from tech background, is companies for oftentimes get too much candidates. So that actually makes it very hard from a job board to like think about how, like, before you would see these lists of like, oh, we just curated 20 companies and now we make like $300K a year, right? I don't think that's possible right now because the labor market's like shifted so much in the white collar workforce. That's kind of the overall. I do have paying customers, but it's not like the majority of my revenue. So they mostly pay to either advertise or like advertise something adjacent in climate. I don't have to go into too much of the detail unless you want me to, but advertise something adjacent in climate, or companies who do pay to promote their job listing, which is a common thing in job boards.
Yeah. So you have got a lot of visitors coming to your website every day. So you're monetizing those eyeballs with some very specific advertising that should be interesting to the people who are visiting your site. And you have a newsletter as well that goes out, and some of that advertising ends up in the newsletter as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I would say that. And I think one positive actually about this approach, this meta approach that I've been doing, which is like, hey, this doesn't need to be the thing that like feeds me, right? Like, let me try to grow, but I'm not going to force it. But once it's out there, it's software, right? So it just stays out there. The maintenance cost is not super high. One really positive thing has been that I'm able to like make design choices or product choices without having to have the constraint of the I need revenues to like hit revenue. Yeah. So for example, right? There are very few job boards that actually just scrape everything and aggregate everything and present it out there, because usually how I've looked at like dozens of job boards at this point. Usually how they monetize is you pay to post, or you pay and we'll scrape you. Like there's usually some kind of thing where it's like to get a job you have to pay to get a job listed, right? So that means that it's less useful for the job seeker, versus for me, I was just like, I'm just going to get as many jobs as possible and then I'll figure out how to monetize from there.
When you were talking more about the filters of the site, but something that has been rattling around in my brain as I look at the site is people who are coming and looking for jobs are ultimately have some sense of what they're interested in. I imagine, maybe not. Maybe they're casting a wide net. Certainly a lot of the folks I speak to on a regular basis have some idea of what they're interested in. One of the things I'm noticing, kind of off the bat, is there aren't obvious filters for like the type of person you are, the type of background you have. Like I am an engineer or product manager or a scientist. And I'm wondering, like, is that just something that isn't normally provided as you scrape this data, or like, is that a hard problem to solve for in the format that you have?
So generally, there is no, like, I guess back up a little bit. First principles, there's no central jobs repository, right? So there's no central list of like, what is a climate tech company either. You have these newsletters out there, or like media businesses that try to aggregate them, but there's no like, it's kind of a fuzzy thing, right? So similarly with job titles, it's relatively fuzzy as well. I actually, in the footer of the website, you can see like I have some pre-done filters for you, like software engineer jobs, hardware engineer jobs, but it could, like some companies would call software engineer software developer, right? And so if you have 30,000 jobs, the title variation is pretty high. Most people, when they look for a specific position, they'll just search for keywords in the position title, and that's kind of where they go from. I think maybe down the line, making some kind of like, you could do, you can kind of do some categorization on the job title. That's not something that I've prioritized yet, but generally people will search for position titles there's like 3 text filters. One of them is position titles.
Yeah, there's no like ISO standard for a job posting, right? What it has to have, what the fields are called, etc.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's correct.
I think there's certainly opinions about what should be in a job posting.
Right, salary and stuff like that.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, no doubt. But like, okay, but I guess like one of the things that would be interesting to me is someone who literally spends like 30% or more of his like conversations online with people talking about jobs and climate is I often get asked like, what are the roles? Like I do X currently at company Y. Is there even a role like mine? And I think like one thing that is like unique about becoming the source of truth for jobs in climate is at some point the data around that, the metadata, like, green chemists are the most hired job right now, or most sought after job across climate roles, right? Or marketing, something that could just be like, you wouldn't even anticipate that, right? But that could also help align people at university who are trying to think about what their major is going to be. And they want to ensure that they get a job, in these sorts of industries. Or maybe just someone who's transitioning and they're trying to figure out how to rebrand their CV so that they get noticed. Those are, I think that's partially where the question comes from. It's yes, in one part, I want to find the job that's right for me, but also like, I want to know what jobs like I can position myself for.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple thoughts. I actually have some of this data I'll show in like after I make this point. I think one of the difficulties with climate tech is it's not an industry. It's very broad. It's like a cross economy trend, right? So what ends up happening is you get a lot of heterogeneity, just like everywhere. Like what the job titles, stuff like that. And it's actually pretty international too. The like jobs I have among the 1,000 companies. So I'll just make that point first. I've actually done some charts and I'll be releasing more in next month. I'm working with a couple of folks right now that by the time this podcast releases, it'll likely be out. Those of you in the audience or listening, you probably won't be able to see this, but you can follow along. I went to climatetechlist.com/charts. And so what I've done is some preliminary like kind of views on based on this data, right? And I'll just show you the one on roles. I did a very little like preliminary grouping. This is in Tableau of like types of jobs. And I had 2 meta categories, engineer or not, something technical or not. And then among that, what types of engineers and like what types of non-engineering roles. This mostly maps to like a software tech company mapping, but you can imagine I can like add stuff for, scientists or whatever. And I think the big takeaway for me here is like, there's just a lot of jobs, actually, types of roles you may not expect. As expected, there's a lot of battery engineering jobs. But there's also a lot of like sales jobs within these, right? And so I'll be releasing like a more in-depth breakdown of this later on.
I just want to say this is awesome, and I love that you're using tree map charts.
Yeah, everyone loves the tree map.
It's my favorite. It's been my favorite chart for such a long time. So I'm gonna pour one out for the tree map. I love it. And here I think it's a great way to dig into this data. So yeah, absolutely. Anyone who's doing a career exploration, trying to think about what kind of jobs they could position themselves for, I think this chart section on the climatetechlist.com is a fantastic resource.
Thank you. Yeah, just climatetechlist.com/charts. You'll see it there.
Stephen, do you have ambitions? I noticed that within the chart of roles, I imagine you probably still have a lot of work to do on those other categories, the ones that are quite large right now. Maybe they'll be a little smaller when folks are finally able to look at this. So I'm wondering, like, have you been thinking about like AI classification and things like that to try to help you parse through some of this stuff?
Yeah, now that we have, point.
Yeah, all that.
So what I've done right now, what's been like, I don't know, my biggest use of like GPT 3.5 has been categorizing locations, because that's fairly easy. The prompt is like, hey, this is the string, Seattle, Washington. Can you tell me what the state the region and the country is, right? So I've done that for like all of these, and that's how I'm able to get these breakdowns of the state and regions. And part of this analysis that's going to be released is categorizing these titles. But it's a little harder because there's no preconceived, like there's no ISO standard on like what the roles are. So you kind of have to like prompt engineer your way to being like, here's a list of 100 roles. Can you categorize it? But we're definitely using that.
Very cool.
Are there other ways that you're using AI technologies in this?
Not really. I think for what I'm doing right now, which is mostly structured data, besides this like categorization stuff, I don't see, or at least I've not encountered too much. Like maybe somewhat for like marketing material. So one thing people may not know is like a lot of my weekly newsletter is now, it's not auto-generated like with AI, but it's programmatically generated because I'm pulling in, recategorizing every company by the name, and then adding the job listing. Just go on climatechlist.substack.com and you'll see. Actually, one funny thing I do there is I add a company emoji to every company name, and that's like kind of hard to do for like 1,000 companies. So that's like another use case of GPT 3.5.
I was going to ask you about the newsletter because as I was looking over it before the podcast, I was like, and thinking about a newsletter of my own, I was like, I wonder how he's pulling this all together, because there's a lot of content in that newsletter that comes out pretty regularly. So you're doing it programmatically, just not Gen AI.
Well, except the emoji. Yeah,
except
exactly.
the emojis.
Yeah.
Except the emojis. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So and like related to Climate Tech List, I run a Boston specific newsletter, and I know live in Boston. That's actually been probably my most successful newsletter in terms of like ROI. Like I just compile all the events together. It's not trivial, but it's not like the hardest thing, and it still takes some time. But I've been able to like cut that down a lot because I used a lot of automation techniques I learned from Airtable. And I wrote a blog post on how I did it, so I can link that. We can link that in the show notes and stuff. So that's, I would say, like combination of Gen AI and just automation in general, which I learned from my time at Airtable, has been pretty helpful. I think the best like content is like analysis on stuff, which occasionally I'll release. Like I'll be releasing it based on this data. If you look at the Climate Tech List blog, there's a bunch of thought pieces about like why join a climate tech company, what are frameworks to think about them, what's bits versus atoms, stuff like that. But given this is like a solo endeavor, it's not the highest priority thing. And there's a lot of people writing a lot of good content about climate tech out there.
Well, Jonathan, that was an interesting discussion with Stephen about his path to creating Climate Tech List. It's such a simple concept, and it's grown into a powerful tool for climate tech job seekers.
I totally agree, Gregory. What stood out was the tremendous variety of opportunities in this emerging field. Climate tech encompasses roles across industries and functions. It's definitely far more than just a niche.
I was really inspired by his personal transition into this space as well, from software engineer to creating these tools. For those interested in pursuing climate tech, it's a good reminder that there are a lot of ways to get involved. His website can connect you with top postings aligned with your background. Well, thanks for listening to this episode of Conversations on Careers in Climate Tech. Be sure to check out part 2 of our conversation with Stephen Zhang in the podcast feed, where we talk more about strategies and frameworks to help job seekers identify where they fit within the climate tech sector, and the importance of a systematic approach to the job search process.
Thank you for listening to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or classmate. Help others find the show by leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Conversations on Careers and Professional Life is produced by me, Gregory Heller, with support from the Foster School of Business Office of MBA Career Management. Learn more about the show, find show notes, and past episodes, and get in touch with me at conversationsoncareers.com. This episode was produced with editing and engineering support from Amelia Nguyen. a student in the Communication Leadership Master's Program at the University of Washington, and made possible in part with funding from Snowcap, a venture capital firm investing in early-stage platforms that directly and indirectly solve the climate crisis. Learn more at snowcap.vc. That's SNOCAP.vc.